Good play by Kemmel, and again. 3-1! A brilliant individual goal by this hard little professional has put Scotland in dreamland. The miracle is beginning to happen. They need one more to qualify. And Kemmel, first one, then two. Then he faced up his own player and another defender. He was clear, and finishing like this is lethal.
That distinctive music, dear listeners, for anyone of a certain age can mean only one thing: the 1978 World Cup, in particular the Scottish team's participation in, for me, one of the great World Cup tournaments of all time. Welcome to the Football History Podcast. My name is Nick Hart, and joining me is professional Scot, Mr. Neil Andrews, football writer and professional Scot. How are you doing, mate?
I'm very well. Hopefully my Scottish accent won't put the listeners off.
Everyone around the world, everyone listening to this, will say, we don't sound very Scottish, does he? The 1978 World Cup played in Argentina, of course. For me, on a personal note, it was one of the first World Cups. I'd seen the 74 World Cup, which had been played in West Germany, as it was then. And that was the first time I'd seen a major tournament played on colour television, very dramatic colour television. But this was 78 was the first time I'd seen what I call a spectacular tournament. And obviously with the benefit of hindsight and with time, many years after the event, it was in some ways a sad tournament in many respects because of the political situation in Argentina at that time. But my gosh, it was spectacular. The Argentine fans with their ticker tape welcomes is something that will, as a 17-year-old at the time, that was a level of football I'd never seen before, and it was one of my most memorable World Cups. Were you young enough to remember it, or are you old enough to remember it, or did it predate you slightly?
No, I was 6 in the World Cup. So old enough to know what it is. And I know I was an avid follower of it. And I know this from an historical document. So when my gran died a couple of years ago, we were sorting out her house and I came across an old exercise book from primary school when I was 6. And in it are 2 pictures. One was Joe Jordan scoring against Peru. And one was Holland scoring their equaliser against Argentina in the final. And both were remarkably accurate, even though they weren't lifelike figures, to be fair. But yes, so I remember being obsessed with that World Cup because I had all the Scotland paraphernalia. I had a bag with it. I had posters, I had postcards, and most important of all, I had the kit as well. So I was very invested in the Scotland team in that World Cup and remember it very clearly. And, even years later, I'd always talk about Harry Hand's goal against Italy. But it was... the goal it seemed like he started, he shot from Holland and, it ended up in the back of the net in Argentina. It was that far out. It was kind of, the long range effort that sticks in your mind and the goals kind of stick in your mind at the time. Because I know people talk about 1982. And as much as I enjoyed 1982, 78, I think would always be my favourite because it was the first one.
Yeah, I think that's one of the effects, benefits, whatever you want to call it, of becoming old is that tournaments of that era stand out in your mind in a way that others don't since. I mean, I was trying to think before we started to speak today of another tournament that felt as spectacular as this. And I suppose maybe you could talk about Italia 90, maybe to some level. The South African World Cup of 2010 with the Venezuelans. But this was an extravaganza of football played in a hotbed nation. And that's for me is where World Cups ought to be played. The Argentine fans, and in the end, as it would turn out, the host win for Argentina, beating a very good Dutch side in the final. And we'll come back to that Dutch side shortly. But it looked and felt like a proper World Cup played in a country that really cared about it, and you don't always get that. We haven't got it in the modern kind of corporate era, do you? It's one of the one of the sad effects of money coming into it on the grand scale. We seem to be like Qatar, I'm thinking of now, but to some extent, some of the other locations that it's been played in since.
I think there was a couple of reasons why it kind of suddenly stood out. Because you remember West Germany, it was torrential rain. And the Brazil team had forgotten their heritage, as it were, and were kicking everyone. Wasn't really special. There was a couple of shocks, etc. But it was kind of the first one in colour, bit of sponsorship. It was really not really the same after Mexico in 1970. So the other thing going, I think, for it in Argentina, and I think the problem with the World Cup today, or should we say people's thoughts and feelings towards 1978 now, is very much tarnished by, I don't want to say perfect 2020 hindsight or rose vision spectacles, but people look at the teams and think, well, why the hell would Scotland have a chance? Why are they considered favourites? What people failed to forget was the state those teams are in. It was one of the most open World Cups because so many teams were, should we say, at that point where, they were either rebuilding or, a great team was kind of fading away kind of thing. They were in transition, either good or bad. And as a result, teams went there and it was sort of like Scotland went with an awful lot of form behind them over the previous couple of years. And I know everyone goes on about Ali's army, etc., but he had put together quite a team to the point that João Havelange, who was FIFA president, predicted an Argentina-Scotland final. And people kind of forget that because, they look at West Germany, who weren't the side they were, as they were in 74.
No.
Dutch weren't the same side.
Well, they were lacking Johan Cruyff, no Cruyff in the Dutch side, which is a major.
They had issues with the goalkeeper as well. And they ended up with the same goalkeeper in 74. Who perfectly decent goalkeeper, not a World Cup final goalkeeper because of injuries to their first choice keeper. The keeper they should have had wasn't going because he fell out with Cruyff years before. But then you had Italy. Italy, I think, finished fourth. But, that Italian side, that was a young Italian side, and nothing was really expected of them. And they managed to actually win the group. They actually beat Argentina as well. So, you had Poland as well. We were going through a bit of transition from the 73 side. You had Hungary. It was quite an open competition. And no one could really predict who was going to win it. Brazil was still, kicking several shades or whatever out of the opposition as well as playing some fancy football. Spain weren't the Spain team you would think of today.
No.
It was funny outside. And, Sweden were a strong team, and Austria were, a very strong team at the time.
The French side was a classic one as well. I mean, that, again, whether it be contenders for the tournament, but that was Jean Tigana, I think, was in that French team from memory. I haven't checked that fact. So
he was with Platini as well. Young Platini was there. I think Platini was only 21, but they had a lot of bad luck and lost by the odd goal to Argentina and Italy. Went home, but obviously. Everyone remembers the French side for wearing that green and white strip because there was a clash of strips because Hungary and France have both bought their away strip to the same day.
The tournament was played. It was the Southern Hemisphere winter. I think it was played in our summer, but the Southern Hemisphere winter. So unusually for a World Cup, which to my young mind always were played in the heat of Mexico. That was the classic one that I have been most aware of. But it was quite odd to see long sleeve shirts and clearly windy conditions and blokes wearing jackets in the crowd. It's not what you associate with a World Cup. I mean, I suppose the first thing we have to say, I've touched on it already, and again, with hindsight is wonderful, as we all know in this life. Underpinning the FIFA 1978 World Cup was the fact that there'd been the military coup in Argentina just 2 years before. And now, how old would I have been then? I've been 15, going towards 17 by the time the actual World Cup was played. So I was kind of news. I would watch the news, but at that age, things don't really mean they don't sink in. I don't know. You don't have a depth of understanding as to what that meant. And of course, many of the the military junta that had taken over in Argentina in 1976 had committed and would go on to commit more and more atrocities locally. It was reported, as I remember it, Neil, but I don't remember. As a kid, it doesn't sink in what that means. And since then, I've watched documentaries. There was one that I saw a couple of years ago. I think maybe might have been Match of the Day that had done a documentary, and I'm sure it was with Mario Kempes, the famous scorer of the winning goal. In the end, talking about his treatment and his family's treatment at the hands of the army in Argentina, and it's an eye opener because, you know, as a 17-year-old, I watched it as purely as a football tournament. That's all that I cared about, was all I could absorb. Now you look at it and you realise what had happened in the preceding period to it, and then in the post-World Cup period. The World Cup winning team were not treated necessarily as the heroes they thought they might have been by the military. It's as I say, there's underpinning of sadness to it all.
Yeah, they kind of should we say kept the military in power for a bit because, you know, they won the World Cup.
Yeah.
But, you know, you had this kind of stark contrast because they built the most what's the word I'm looking at, high-tech television center for the World Cup in South America. You know, beaming color pictures around the world. You could only watch it in black and white in Argentina, ironically, because there were no color tellies. You know, there was that famous myth that was put around by an article that was then reprinted in the Guardian about the black posts at the bottom of the black rings at the bottom of the goalposts were there to kind of symbolize the missing in Argentina.
That disappeared.
But it wasn't actually, because one of them in Mendoza were actually red, and the reason why they were there is for the black and white TV so they could get the contrast. Because you'd also see them, I think you see them the 1980 European Championships, 1982 World Cup as well. And in South America, they've gotten quite a lot on the post because it is a thing there. So Scotland went on tour to South America the previous year in '77 and played Argentina. And the posts, I think they played in Boca Juniors Stadium because the posts were blue and yellow. And it's for black and white TV to give the contrast between the white lines and the posts and, you know, the poor technology back then. But yeah, there was this undercurrent that kind of still dogs the tournament to this day in terms of the Peru-Argentina game and the 6-0. You know, and the alleged shipments of corn from Argentina to Peru, and, you know, Peru throwing the game with an Argentinian goalkeeper. How true that is, you know, it's got all the ingredients you need for a good spy thriller, etc. But the truth is, at the beginning, you know, I think Peru hit the post twice and then just folded. I don't know how much that's true. I don't, you know, you know. But
I don't think there's evidence to support it. It's
there is a slight evidence. There's circumstantial evidence, but
it has the ring of truth, Neil, doesn't it? But nothing to. Yeah.
There's because there's a dark story around Willie Johnson's found drug test as well.
Okay.
Because during that South American tour, Johnston was on fire. Played very well against Chile and was tearing Argentina apart until he got into a fight and got sent off. And apparently he said one of the Argentinian players, I think it was the wonderfully named Daniel Killer, who said, you know, you're too good, you won't be here next year. And he always says that he was targeted by the Argentinians for the kind of, should we say, to give the urine sample. And that's kind of backed up to a certain extent in that he wasn't actually the first choice to go give the sample after the Peru game. Right. It was Kenny Dalglish and I think Archie Gemmill. And in the end, it turned out to be Kenny Dalglish and Willie Johnston. He said, you know, we both went, and he looked at Kenny Dalglish's sample. He looked at it and went, oh, mine's a lot darker here. There's something going on. But, you know, he did admit he did take those, you know, the tablets that were kind of used throughout English football. So, you know, there is kind of, you know, that's not saying he's not innocent at all because he admits to taking, was it Reactivin, I think it was, which was kind of an energy booster you could get in boots. But, you know, he kind of does pinpoint to that game and, you know, the underlining, not threats, but the intimidation and the kind of, you know, they were going to win it at all costs. They couldn't afford to lose, basically.
Well, I think it's that, actually. I mean, I was just going to make the same point. The military junta that had taken over in 70s. Ironically, listeners, reading about this is always, I find this a fascinating tournament because I hadn't realised the logo. One of my favourite logos, it's the World Cup, which is the Argentine sky blue and white in a kind of like a curve around an old black and white panelled football. But I didn't realise that was an imitation of the trademark gesture of the previous president, Juan Perón, who had been ousted by the army, and that he had a kind of like an arms curved gesture to embrace the people, and that was an imitation of that. The junta wanted to change it, but they were too far close to the tournament to actually change the logo. So ironically, they had to play under the previous man's logo. The whole tournament was played out with his logo as their badge, which is kind of funny, if you like. But certainly, Scotland came into the tournament, Neil, as we were just saying off air, weren't we? You look back at the old YouTube footage, and there isn't. I mean, some of it is really good, and some of the footage is a bit shaky. But that was a decent Scottish side, and obviously they came a cropper initially against Peru, who were, I think you said, were South American champions, which I don't think was fully absorbed in England in Britain at the time.
They were reigning champions. They'd won it in 75. And they still had the team that had impressed many in Mexico in 1970. So they still had Cubillas and Hector Champos.
Teofilio Cubillas,
yeah. But Ali McLeod had problems. That's not to say he had problems per se. He had problems with his squad in that, he'd lost Sandy Jardine. He'd also lost Danny McGrain, who was arguably the finest right back in the world at the time.
Very decent.
So he'd had a niggling ankle injury all during the competition. And in the home championships just before that, Gordon McQueen did a gold line clearance, whacked his knee into the post against Wales, and was, although he still went, he was effectively out of the World Cup. And so in that Peru game, he played Kenny Burns, or as Brian Clough called him, Kenneth Burns, and he played Forsyth. And he had Martin Buchan playing as a left back. And he wasn't going in there with his strongest defence. I think that back four is the first time they'd ever played with each other. But he had other problems elsewhere. So he was a very loyal man. And that selection went back, I think it went back as far as, the qualifying games. Because what people really do forget is that Scotland beat the reigning European champions to get there in Czechoslovakia.
Yes, that's right.
There is the disputed game against Wales. But, even if that game had ended 0-0, I think what people forget is Wales still had to go to Czechoslovakia, and they ended up losing that game 3-0. So it may have probably put the Czechs back into the running, but is what it is. A handball goes in, and then Dalglish makes it 2-0. And if you've seen the pictures of all the bottles at Anfield following morning, but going back to the squad, he was very loyal to that team that got him there. And he stuck with the midfield of Bruce Rioch and Don Masson, who hadn't really been performing at club level. Even Bruce Rioch admits that he was under par. And so it started off really well, 1-0 up against Joe Jordan. And then just shortly before half-time, they equalised. Very poor mistake. It came down the right side. Danny McGrain was there. Would it have happened? Don't know. Was his replacement international quality? Don't know. I think that was his first competitive game as well, funny enough. The guy that came into play, I think it was Tom Forsyth.
Forsyth, just looking at the back line was our goalkeeper Alan Ruff, Martin Buck and Stuart Kennedy, Tom Forsyth and Kenny Burns listed as defenders.
It could have been Kennedy, sorry, at right back. I think Forsyth was in the middle. But they definitely, it's definitely their first kind of competitive game. But then in the second half, Scotland won the penalty, and Don Masson, who was a very good penalty taker,
decent player, Notts County player,
arguably the worst penalty of all time, and then they went down the other end and scored. But Alan Ruff came in for a lot of stick, for some of the Peru goals. There was a lot of laughter at his expense, especially from English pundits. But he does say, if you look at that free kick that Cubillas scored, he said the problem was he asked who takes the free kicks, and no one knew, because for whatever reason, Ali McLeod wanted to focus on the strengths of his own team and not try to install fear into.
So there wasn't much
like,
intelligence about the Peruvian side. Yeah.
No, nor the Iranian side, funny enough. And no one really knew who took the free kicks. But as he said, there had been a substitution, and Lou Macari was on the end of the wall, and that wasn't his normal place. And if you look at the free kick, Lou Macari actually ducks and moves out of the way of the ball. If he stood there, it would have hit him square in the face. And as Ross said, he moved, and he had to get across the goal. And to his credit, he made an awful lot of space up. And he does get a fingertip to it. He really does, make an effort to keep the ball out. But the wall should have done its job there. And he kind of come into a bit of a kicking for it. But afterwards, everyone's going this thing. But because Willie Johnston failed the drugs test, it actually worked out better for Scotland. Because they lost the game, the result stood. If Scotland had won and drawn, and
then he failed it.
It would have meant that Peru would have had a 3-0 victory, walkover, which would have made life even more complicated for the team. But after the drug scandal hit, Don Masson went inside some kind of strange support of Willie Johnson, went to Alan McLeod and said he'd also taken Reactivin. Whether he had or not, they don't know, but he was trying to support, oh yeah, I've done it too. So rather than risk it, he dropped Don Masson for the rest of the tournament. And that kind of... So, they've lost Don Masson now. They've lost Willie Johnson. Riek was out injured for the Iran game. And, things were falling apart. And it was beyond Danny McLeod's control. But, because he'd instilled such euphoria and such confidence, people were saying it was misplaced. I don't think it was misplaced to stretch the imagination. I know he was going around talking about, I'd like to come back with a medal and I hope it's the gold one. And he gets pilloried for that now, especially by English fans. But, England was singing about back home in 1970. This time we're going to get it right in 1982. And, Graham Taylor actually told England fans to put their feet up, get a beer and enjoy the competition because we're going to win it for, Euro 92.
I don't... to some level, I don't know what people think a manager will say. I mean, if you're going to go to a tournament, unless you're rank outsiders, then you can say you're going to want to go as far as you possibly can do, perhaps, or some variation of that. But, your aim should be to win the game in front of you and then progress. And then ultimately your aim must be to win it, because I don't know why else you're there if you're not there to hopefully, it's not silverware, it's goldware. But you know what I mean? What's the point of going if that's not your aim?
Yeah, he did. He did install and he did build confidence up. People talk about the kind of parade before they left, the celebration parade. That wasn't actually his idea. He didn't want to do it. If you see him walk out, he's got his head bowed, his hands in his pockets. He's a bit embarrassed by it. That was the Scottish FA trying to get some money because they needed money. They were actually quite skint at the time, which also caused problems in Argentina because the hotel they got, apparently the beds were rock hard. There was no water in the swimming pool. There was nowhere to relax. Because of what had happened in 72 at the Olympics, there was still high security. And, players weren't allowed out. When they were allowed out, you got press reports saying that all the Scottish players were drunk and they're all drinking whiskey and what have you. And, they're absolutely legless. And 3 of them broke out to go to a casino. And when they came back, they had to break in and they were faced by armed guard. Which I don't know whether it's true or not, but it's a great story that Alan Rough stuck his hands in the air and went, "Don't shoot, I'm the goalkeeper." But,
I'm just looking at the front line there. Kenny Dalglish and Joe Jordan. I mean, as we've said a few times, hindsight is easy. That's a decent front line. I think that would take the field for any team anywhere in the world. 2 top quality players there in their different ways.
Well, Dalglish was there as a given. He just won the European Cup with Liverpool. He just come off a great, season with Liverpool and, his debut season in English football. Yeah. Joe Jordan was there because he'd scored some very important goals. He scored against Czechoslovakia. He'd played his part in the Wales victory. But, he'd also scored, at the World Cup previously. And he'd also scored, some very, very big goals for Scotland over the, course of the previous 4 or 5 years. Interestingly enough, there was, then who'd you take with them? There was Derek Johnston, who had scored 30 goals at Rangers and was kind of on fire. But he decided he then wanted to play centre-back. He had a complete loss of confidence and faith and didn't want to play up front anymore. Then you had, Joe Harper, who Ali McLeod knew from his Aberdeen days, who, was more the foil for, the like replacement for Kenny Dalglish. But, there was a case for Andy Gray and Ian Wallace as well, who I think was knocking him in for Coventry at the time. I think they dismissed Wallace quite early on. But Andy Gray had just won, Player of the Year and Young Player of the Year. But he'd only had a handful of caps and hadn't really performed for Scotland. And Ali McLeod would have had a lot of explaining to do. You didn't take the guy at Rangers who just scored 30 goals instead of this youngster. But goals were hard to come by. So it was a problem. But, between the the Peru and the Iran game, they still hadn't sorted the bonuses for winning the World Cup. And the bonuses they were on was not great, if I'm honest. I think they were on I think the Scottish FA agreed to give the squad £14,000 between them if they'd won the World Cup, which even in 1978, was not a great deal of money. But, that was ongoing throughout the tournament because, they hadn't agreed it beforehand. The players wanted to know what they were getting. They just got the new Umbro strips and they were complaining, we're advertising Umbro, you got paid for that, you don't need the money, etc. Yeah. But the Scottish FA at the time was really brassic, so did need the money. So, was trying to get as much from this competition as they could. The fact that hotel wasn't very good as well, really, basically ate into the confidence, It really kind of, they were just demoralised. And after the Peru game, it just went downhill. And as Bruce Rioch said, the worst horror show he's ever seen was Scotland-Iran because he was sitting on the sideline.
Well, that was, Peru would finish 3-1. Early goal for Joe Jordan for Scotland, going 1-up. Then Cueto on 43, and then 2 from one of the great players, Teofilio Cubillas on 71 and 77, and that was good night Vienna for Scotland in that game. But I think I just want to say, having watched the YouTube footage again before we move on to Iran, Neil, that was a very, very decent Peruvian side, and probably not well known for poor reasons in this country. The quality of that side wasn't well known, and that was a decent team that beat Scotland. But I think the Iran game was really where the wheels would come off of the Scottish tournament. Really, 1-1 that would finish. That really was Iran had already been beaten 3-0 by Holland. That would be a game that really, there's no excuses on that one. How do you see that 1-1 draw from your side?
A lot of it was in, again, he changed the back line. So Willie Donaghy came in at left back, which meant Buchan moved across to partner. I'm going to call him Kenneth Burns because he makes me laugh in the middle. And that was the first time they'd played together. So there was a lot of unknowns, unfamiliarity. He brought in Archie Gemmill in the middle as one of the replacements, I think, for Rioch. And he brought in John Robertson down the left, hoping to kind of see the form he'd shown for Forest when they won the league that season. But the key thing was that he was going to play Graham Souness. And he had a choice, Graham Souness or Lou Macari. And he went with Lou Macari. Graham Souness, it played, Scotland probably would have won that game. The problem Ali McLeod had was that everyone knows Graham Souness now. At the time, I think he'd only played 6 times for Scotland. He was a relatively international novice. And I think he went with Macari just for the experience. But Macari was one of those that was kind of in the middle of the furore about the bonuses, etc. Right. He'd ducked for the Peru goal, obviously. And it was a case of just misfiring. And Scotland's goal came from the most bizarre goal you'll ever see. I'm not even going to try and pronounce the Iranian guy who scored its name.
I might have a go. Eskandarian.
He
probably wrong.
Basically, he bumped into the goalkeeper and with an open goal, whacked it straight into the back of the net. And it's sort of like the Scotland players looked embarrassed. But, second half, again, down the flank where Danny McGrain would have been, they scored a goal. It was a very sloppy goal to give away and it just misfired. In the end of that game, that's the famous thing where all the Scotland fans were, turned on Ali McLeod, turned on the fans, turned on the team coach, etc. Because a lot of them have spent an awful lot of money to get there. Have you ever seen?
It was not easy. No, this was
a documentary. Scotland 78 Love Story. You hear some of the stories. People flying to Barbados, then going across by a boat, then getting the train down, and steamers, etc. People selling their shops and businesses to go.
Yeah. Madness in hindsight, but there we are. Scotland came into the final game of their group still with a chance of qualification. I think did they not have to beat Holland by
3 clear
2
goals.
goals, 3 clear
3 clear
goals.
goals, yeah.
From memory.
So
Yeah.
the way it turned out, and this is another thing people overlook. People think, oh, Holland just took their foot off the gas because, they'd already qualified. They hadn't. So if Scotland won by 3 clear goals, they would have gone through and not the Dutch.
Yeah.
And the chips were stacked against them. Souness came in, Rioch came back in, and all of a sudden they had a lot stronger side, which clearly showed in the game itself. What people forget, I think Rioch hit the bar early on. I think Joe Jordan had a goal wiped out, and then Scotland were punished with a penalty that was never a penalty. It was a clear tackle, I think, by Kennedy, and the ref blew up, gave a penalty, and all of a sudden they're 1-0 down. Then Kenny Dalglish equalised, and then Scotland got their own penalty. Gemmell scored, and then you've got that fantastic moment when Archie Gemmell scored one of the goals of the tournament, which everyone's purely familiar with. And then you'll see Graham Souness saying, just need one more goal. And then 2 minutes later,
Johnny Rep, the great name.
Yeah.
John, I always thought it was a fact. I mean, that was a very decent Dutch side then. I'm just looking, talking about the Scottish team, but I'm just looking at some of the names in the Dutch side. Johan Neeskens had been a mainstay of the 74 Dutch side. Johnny Rep, I think just on name alone, I always thought it had to be a brilliant player just because of his name. But, there was a decent Dutch side there.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. There's a funny story about Johnny Rep from the 1982 World Cup. He went as a kind of a pundit, and he went to try and watch as many games as possible. And he went to see Scotland v Brazil, and he stood in the Scotland end, and he thought, no one will recognise me.
Everyone recognised it.
He said, this bloke kept turning around, look at him, and he went, "You're the bloke that killed Scotland." And he turned around and went, "Yes, I am."
Fair play to him. I mean, that Dutch side. I mean, we've said it already, but that was a team that would go the distance to the final and be very unlucky because I remember watching the World Cup final, and they actually hit the post at 1-1 in the last moment of regular time before Argentina would win it.
I remember that. They had the same problem, so they lost their goalkeeper in the second round. I think in the game against Italy, which they had to win to make the final, when Ariane scored that goal. And what's his name went in goal again?
Youngblood is in goal against.
He went in goal. Yeah, he went in goal again, and Jan van Beveren was the best Dutch goalkeeper of the 1970s, but he kept falling out with Johan Cruyff, and they brought him back in '76. And Johan Cruyff made life difficult for him again, and he turned around and said, "Right, I'm never playing for you again." If they had him in goal, I think, the 2 World Cups went begging. He was injured actually for 74 and was only given, half a game to prove his fitness. But in 78, he was in his prime. They probably would have won. But, like you said, they got to the final. And, before the final, Argentina delayed coming out. And when they came out, they complained. I can never remember it was Rennie van der Kerkhoff or his brother that had the cast on his hand. But
I believe it was Rene because he had damaged his hand. He was wearing a plaster cast, which the Argentines objected to.
Yeah, which kind of delayed it. They were doing all the kind of mind games, but they hit the post in the last seconds. I still remember that clearly.
But I mean that the Archie Gemmell goal. I mean, obviously it's immortalised in Train Spotting. Everyone knows the anyone that was of that time will remember it. And I suppose in a very Scottish way, Neil, it was so close so far, wasn't it? I mean, because it was tantalisingly close for a few moments until that Johnny Rep goal, which then probably put it just a touch too far out of reach. But
it's one of the glorious failures. But Alan McLeod took a lot of the blame and was never the same person again. And he basically wanted to do the best for Scotland. He basically wanted to do the best. He wasn't going out there to fail. Admittedly, some circumstances got the better of him. Admittedly, he made some poor selections. A lot of the players let him down. But, for a good 2 years, he made the Scottish fans believe that they had a team who could compete rather than just show up and play along. And the results are proving that. They beat Chile 4-2 in a spectacular performance, drew 1-1 with Argentina, lost only to 2 late goals to Brazil. They beat England at Wembley, the famous one with the crossbars, etc. He got the results against Czechoslovakia, got the results against Wales. And yeah, he was getting there, and he kind of did it in a very short space of time because Joe Allman resigned to go manage Hearts, I think it was, and they originally offered the role to Jock Stein, who looked like he was going to take it, then turned it down. And the only other person that had won a domestic trophy in recent years in Scottish football was Ali McLeod, and he turned around a failing Aberdeen team and took them to third in the league and won the cup. So, they offered him the job. He wanted 48 hours to think about it, and they kind of put pressure on him. And so, he took the job, thinking about it. He was only paid £14,000 a year for it as well. And
it's strange when you think that.
Well, actually, it's, to be fair, it was about the same as I think Tommy Docherty was getting at Man United. They weren't paid well. But, he kind of installed this enthusiasm. He said, I'm a winner, and the players were saying, he came in, some of them were thinking, what's he on, basically saying this. But, like you say, there's no point going into a game and saying, we're going to lose. Oh,
no, who does that? No one does that. Yeah. No manager does that.
Yeah. So, he was kind of doing the right thing, kind of the right approach. He when he was on his game, he could get the tactics right. He could get it spot on, but he gets pilloried a lot, mainly in the English press, for saying the same things England managers have said all the time. He gets pilloried for the results against Peru, even though they were like South American champions. The Iran game, that's a given, but you've got to look at the players there. He got let down. There's nothing he can do once they cross the line. But, he took an awful lot of blame. So after they got knocked out, they had to go straight back to Buenos Aires, and they were put into the official FIFA hotel, which apparently was a bit of a dump. And Martin Buchan knew Spanish and got them into a better hotel. And apparently one of the players, who shall remain nameless, when he was walking through the lobbies and saw the bedrooms, turned around to Ali McLeod and said, if only we had a hotel like this in Cordova, imagine what the results would have been like. Yeah, it's like
the hotel is going to make much difference when you get on the pitch, but there we are.
Yeah, but it's kind of, it goes in the mentality, but it's a very interesting World Cup, and Ali McLeod is a very interesting manager. He's a manager that if you learn a bit about him, you understand just why he got the job and why he was so popular and why actually he was very good at the job. It's just it's a bit like Graham Taylor. He's the turnips. One Swedes two.
Another decent man crushed by the, what should we call it, the hysteria that comes with football. I mean, it's just interesting watching the YouTube footage again after all these years. I think it's in the Iranian game actually. I think that they zero in on Ali McLeod in the kind of slightly below ground type team bench they've got there, and you can see the physical impact of this unfolding. We finish a draw, but it was an unfolding disaster from his personal point of view. You can see the human impact on him, Neil.
In his hands. His wife said you could see drain. She's
like
I said, that 78 Love Story documentary. She said she saw him and said he wasn't the same man. He didn't look like Ali McLeod at all.
No.
Because he was always full of life, full of zest, kind of thing. And very jubilant, and he could see it all crumbling away. And he went there with, like I said, good intentions. And Scotland had a very strong team. Well, it had a strong team that had been weakened. And I think that's kind of the problem. When you miss a few parts of the puzzle, it's more difficult to kind of, achieve anything. But at the same time, other teams like the Dutch were missing Johan Cruyff. For example, West Germany didn't have Beckenbauer or Muller. So they weren't the only team to go there without a full strength team. And even Brazil were kind of feeling their way through the changes, shall we say.
We've mentioned the moving on to the second round. I mean, obviously Holland would progress. This was a strangely organised World Cup, listeners, in that the second round was not a knockout; it was another group stage. So you went from group stage to group stage, which I think they persevered with that approach in the '82 Spanish World Cup as well, Neil. But it was an oddly it took some of the drama out in some ways, certainly of the second round in some respects, although. We've mentioned already the pressure of the Argentine military regime needing, and I think they needed a result, they needed a win. So the pressure that comes with that, we probably won't can't really say corruption, but certainly it produced some odd situation. I mean, it's just occurred to me as you were talking earlier on that I remember a very odd incident. Clive Thomas, the Welsh referee, blowing for full time against Brazil. Can't remember their opponents, Sweden.
Yeah.
The ball was in mid-flight from a shot and it went in the net. Spectacular goal. And bang on 45, he said that the whistle, he'd blown the whistle before it entered the net. I mean, never been seen before, never been seen since. We now live in the era of added time, so it probably wouldn't ever be seen. And there's a kind of unspoken rule now, you allow a play to finish before you blow up. But the more I look at that now, with the benefit of hindsight, you wonder what was going into that.
Funny enough, again, Clive Thomas never refereed another World Cup game. But in the official film of 1978, he actually, Ronnie Hellström, the Swedish goalkeeper, actually asked him how long left. And he told Ronnie Hellström the corner kick is the last kick of the game. So he'd already told Ronnie Hellström that it was the last kick of the game.
So that corner kick will be it. Yeah.
And if you ever look at that, you can go on Tube and look at that. Just look at Ronnie Hellström. He's already walking out of his goal because he knows that Clive Thomas has already blown. He's got no interest in it. And the Brazilians did take an awful long time over that corner, to be fair. And yes, that did impact them. You know, at the end of the day, they didn't make the final as a result on goal difference. But, you know, it's one of those strange quirks of football that you have these group games. And again, that's one of the reasons, again, with the kind of West Germany-Austria game, why last group games are now played at the same time. Although, again, if you watch the Austria-West German game, it's only really the last 20 minutes where they start kicking the ball around because they realise, actually, this result, if we do anything, we could get knocked out here.
Yeah. I mean, they did away with. I mean, the Argentine, the more famous example, I suppose, is the Brazil won their last game in the second group stage against Poland 3-1, which meant that Argentina needed, I think it was a 4-goal win or something.
4-goal win, yeah.
They needed a 4-goal win against Peru, who we've already said a few times were a very decent side. And who knows what pressures were brought on the Peruvian team that day. Maybe none. Maybe none.
Well, their goalkeeper was Argentinian. He was born in Argentina. He was a naturalized Peruvian.
I remember watching this. I sat up late.
He got booked at the halfway line for attacking a Polish player.
Oh dear! I remember sitting up late and watching this famous 6-0 win for Argentina because the game's played in the South American time, so the night game started. I think it was about 11 o'clock at night, and they went on till like 1 o'clock in the morning in British time. But this was a famous series of results because Argentina kicked off after Brazil had finished their game, so they knew what they had to do. They needed a 4-goal clear spread, and they would win it 6-0 and qualify for the final. I think we've made our point on that already, Neil. And the final was obviously would turn out to be a classic in the end, 3-1. But for large chunks of the game, I mean, Argentina were kind of edgily in front. I mean, the Dutch they led from a Kempes goal in the 38th minute in the final, and the Dutch actually equalised late. Dick Nanninga, there's a name from the past I've forgotten, which would take it to extra time, but only after the Dutch had actually hit the post. I think it really was the last kick of regular time.
Yeah,
but it would have been very different.
Yeah. Even going back to the first group stage, if you watch that, I mean, Argentina rode their luck. I mean, they lost to Italy.
Yeah,
there were question marks over that, whether they lost to Italy so they would avoid the stronger group, because Italy went into a group with it was Austria, West Germany, and the Dutch, so quite a strong group. Not that Poland, Sweden, and Brazil wasn't that strong, but of the two, you would say the other one was definitely the strongest. But against Hungary in the first game, Hungary went ahead, and they got 2 players sent off. Because it turned into a brawl basically, but and I don't think an Argentinian was even booked, and it was kind of, should we say, fortune favoured them.
I mean, we've mentioned the physical impact and long-term impact on Scottish manager Archie McLeod. I think we can't let Ally McLeod. Sorry, Ally McLeod. Sorry, I'm getting my Archies and my Allys and my McCoists and my McLeods mixed up in my head. Ally McLeod. But I think we can't pass the conversation without mentioning the evident physical impact on the Argentine manager Cesar Menotti, who I remember watching. It was a very 1970s turned out jacket, shirt, and tie with a kind of a 70s style long haircut. But he must have got through 20 fags per game. I mean, he was constantly chain smoking on the side, and gaunt cheekbones. I mean, there was like not an ounce of fat on him. He was clearly he had a haunted look about him. And again, with benefit of hindsight, you can kind of picture why, because he carrying the weight of a nation on his shoulders, and a nation with a ruthless military government. So that's what I call pressure as well. You know,
I mean, it took balls to drop Maradona, and he did it because he didn't think he could cope with the pressure.
Didn't play him, did he? Didn't know. He's right. It didn't. 17-year-old.
Yeah, didn't even put him in the squad. You know, when the people were going for him, you know, he was one of 3 players cut. But you know, it's funny how Ardiles, Villa, Tarantini, etc., ended up in the UK. Sabella, you know, it's suddenly had this influx of Argentinian players. Coming over as a result of that. But I mean, even watching it now, you watch the games, and it's like there were some fantastic goals. Yeah, there's fantastic games there. You know, it's a very maligned World Cup in parts, but you know, I think 82 did kind of knock it into a hot hat to a bit, you know, cocked out for a bit in terms of the games and the drama, because you know they had knockout phases at the end.
Yeah, the quality of the football in '82 was probably there were some standout games. Let's put it that way. There were standout games in this. I think it's, for me, '78 made a visual impact that I've never really forgotten, because it particularly defined. But every Argentine game was played with this ticker tape welcome, where the pitch was covered in bits of white paper, and it was just so spectacular, Neil. It was visually something I'd never seen before, and it stands in my mind, you know, for that reason.
I understand what you mean. Yeah, if you had the grainy coloured pictures and the commentary down the telephone line, there's something about that adds a bit of magic to the night. I remember that kind of commentary going into European Cups and, you know, European Championships and World Cups, well into the kind of mid '80s, where you had the crackly phone line, and it's like suddenly you think, yeah, this is a bit special. This is a bit, you know, exotic. This is a bit glamorous. You know,
it looked exotic. Yeah, we've lost it with we're in the era of HD high instant television, so we've kind of lost it now, and it will never come back. But the magic of the Argentina 1978 World Cup was that the immensity of the paper thrown in the air as the teams come out, the mass hysteria that came with it, the Argentina chants, and the blue sky blue and white flags everywhere. And then eventually it would come good for the country in the end, because the Dutch would hit the post in the final. It would stay 1-1 into extra time, and then Mario Kempes and I've forgotten Bertoni scored. He's the forgotten goal of the finals. Kempes drew the headlines, didn't he?
Awful goalkeeping with that one. Awful goal. Yeah. Youngblood went with his feet. He tried to slide tackle it out rather than dive full stretch. Never worked there. Whether that was just a desperate lunge to give him his due, I don't know. But you know, there's a picture of it where, he's kind of hammering it home. He's kind of trying to stop it like a defender. I don't know.
There we are. The Argentine junta would get their moment of national glory, which, as ever in the way of the world, fades after quite a short space of time. Actually, if national glory can fade quite quickly, and lo, it would fade quite quickly, leading on to 1982 and another attempt at national glory with the seizure of the Falkland Islands. But that's another subject for another podcast, another day, Neil.
That's another World Cup.
Another World Cup. Maybe we'll come back and do Spain 82 another day, mate. I really appreciate your time today. You've got a job interview soon, so I'm going to have to let you go. So
Scottish manager job.
Otherwise, we'd do Spain 82. Big thank you, Neil. I really appreciate your time this morning, mate. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Going on with the referee, between Rioch and the referee, just wants to get on with it. Gemmell. Good play by Gemmell, and again. 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! 3-1! individual goal by this hard little professional has put Scotland in dreamland. The miracle is beginning to happen. They need one more to qualify. And Gebel, first one, then two. Then he faced up his own player and another defender. He was clear, and finishing like this is lethal.